If you play Magic the Gathering long enough, you will eventually play some cards which are called do nothings. So, what is a do nothing in Magic the Gathering? Well, let's look at the definition out of the dictionary as to what a do nothing really is. From dictionary.com, it is a person who chooses to do nothing, a lazy or worthless person, being characterized by the inability or unwillingness to initiate action, work toward a goal, or assume responsibility or the like.
I do nothing.
The second half of this description is actually a little more accurate for what we're looking for in a magic card. Do nothings are usually enchantments that don't do anything the turn they come into play, but once you're able to untap and use their effects to affect the board state, they're very powerful cards. However, they're kind of frowned upon in the competitive scene because usually they cost 6, 7, 8 mana on up, and they don't do anything to win the game on the spot or affect the board state in a way that is going to help you win right away, which is kind of against what competitive players are looking for. So let's look at some do nothing cards because they've actually found some good homes now in the Commander format and Historic Brawl by extension, and let's see what kind of fun we can have with these cards. Alright, first up is Mirror March. For 5 in red, you get an enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, flip a coin until you lose a flip. For each flip you've won, create a token copy of that creature. The tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. This card is a definition of a do-nothing in Magic. It costs a lot of mana, but when it actually gets to do something, it does spectacular effects. I really tried to make this work in Standard when Temur Elementals was a thing, so you could copy things like Omnath of the Royal or Risen Reefs and get a bunch of the ETB triggers as they're going off. But now you can kind of do the same kind of thing in Commander instead, and you get a little more time to mess with it there. Next up we have Divine Visitation. For 3 white, you get an enchantment. If one or more creature tokens would be created under your control, that many 4/4 white angel creature tokens are created instead. Once more, this is a do-nothing card. It doesn't do anything on its own. You have to be able to create tokens in order to get an effect out of the card. And it costs 5 mana, so that's a pretty hefty investment. It's kind of hard to make that sort of thing work in 60-card constructed, but in Commander, oh yes. You can go ahead and cycle your Decree of Justice, make the soldier tokens, but instead they turn into 4/4 angels rather than paying the double X cost and hard casting it. On top of that, the cycling is a lot harder to counter because unless you have something that counters a triggered ability, you can't stop this from going off. So you can just keep on sliding in your angels and going to town. Next up, we have a brand new enchantment from Dominaria United, Vesuvan Uplimancy. For 3 and a blue, you get an enchantment that says whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact or creature you control, create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature, except for it's not legendary. This is a brand new do-nothing from the Dominaria United set, and I have it in the Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief deck, where you are trying to target a bunch of stuff, so you're going to be duplicating things out as you go. So you can kind of copy big creatures, or you can copy creatures that have good enters the battlefield triggers, or things like that, and this thing can spiral out of control really fast. Another more recent 3 and a blue enchantment that does nothing on its own is Necro Duality. You get an enchantment, as I said, for 3 and a blue that says whenever a non-token zombie enters the battlefield under your control, create a token that's a copy of that creature. This is our 4th do nothing in the list, and in Standard, you're probably going to fall behind trying to jam this on the board and do nothing on your 4th turn. But in a format like Commander, where you have like a zombie tribal deck with, Scarab God as your commander or something of that nature, you're going to be able to slam this down, and every zombie you cast from then on out, you get a duplicate copy of it, and things like the Scarab God are going to go out of control and start blasting your opponent for tons of life lost with its upkeep trigger. We're about the midpoint of my list here, and this is one of my favorite do-nothings. It causes so much chaos in a game. This is Hive Mind. For 5 and a blue, you get an enchantment that says whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, each other player copies that spell. Each of those players may choose new targets for the copies. This thing is a Chaos Mage's best friend. I have it in my Xyrus the Writhing Storm deck in order to copy Wheel of Fortune effects and that kind of thing so I can get a bunch of snakes off of it, but I've actually played this in more of a chaotic red-blue deck before where it just got out of control, and it was off of somebody else's spells that caused it. Somebody cast an Enter the Infinite into this thing, Everybody drew all but one card of their deck. Then he cast a Hypergenesis, which allowed them to put all of their artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands onto the field. And once everybody's hands were pretty much emptied and everything was mostly tapped down, I cast a Frantic Search in response to something, and it put a copy of Frantic Search on everybody's stack, and they resolve in reverse turn order. So, and I was on the end of the table, so it went all the way around. I was the last person to get hit, so everybody ran out of cards and decked before, and I won the pod doing that. This thing is just a blast to play. Another one of our more recent do-nothings, Arcane Bombardment. For 4 red, you get an enchantment that says whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, then copy each card exiled with Arcane Bombardment. You may cast any number of the copies without paying their mana costs. This is another one of my favorite do-nothing cards of the recent era, but it takes a little bit of work to get there, because first you got to have something in the graveyard. Now, being that it's a 6 mana card, you're probably likely going to have something in there, but once you have something in there and you start exiling them and chaining them together, this thing will spiral out of control really fast and can burn players down. But people have tried to make it work in Standard, but I think it's going to see a lot more legs in things like Commander. The Bombardment also works very similar to a much older do-nothing enchantment that I also have in my list, and it's a fun one to play because I love me some Chaos Magic, and that is Eye of the Storm. Eye of the Storm is a 5 blue enchantment that says whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, exile it. Then that player copies each instant and sorcery exiled with Eye of the Storm. For each copy, you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. You see what I mean? It acts very similar to Arcane Bombardment, but with some subtle differences. Aside from the obvious one where, it's blue and it costs 1 additional mana compared to Arcane. But it affects each player, not just your spells. Each opponent's spells also get exiled in this thing, so they can also trigger it and get the cards exiled underneath of it, and then you can take advantage of some of their spells, or they can take advantage of yours. So that's why I said it's kind of a good, little chaos tool to throw out there. Even though it doesn't really do anything on its own, it can get wild and create some stacks that are just very difficult to resolve. So keep an eye on how many things are under there, because sometimes it's going to get wild. Next up, we have Grave Betrayal. For 5 black, you have an enchantment that says whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. You're going to notice that most do-nothings are either in red or blue usually. They usually have big splashy effects, and they don't actually do anything for those colors. So here we actually have a black version of that kind of thing, where 7 mana doesn't do anything on its own. You have to have some more mana and an additional spell to get anything out of it. But once you do, it can do some very powerful things. Say you plop this down and then you cast a Damnation. Every creature spell that dies that's not yours is coming back to you at the end of the turn. So this is kind of a very powerful effect, but you got to build around it and you got to be careful with it. The last of our more modern do-nothings is Hallowed Haunting. For 2 white, you get an enchantment that says as long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a white spirit cleric token. That's power is equal to the number of spirits you control. If you've played Standard anytime in the last 10 months or so, you've probably run into this card at some point. It's been played in all kinds of things like the runes decks and green-white enchantments and all kinds of things like that. But it's very powerful. Once you're able to start casting enchantments into this and you start getting spirits going, you can roll somebody over very quickly with this card. And it's not that hard to get to the 7 enchantment threshold to give the stuff flying and vigilance either. The last card we'll take a look at is also one of my favorite cards in the game of Magic, as I love randomness in a game and I love chaos. So this thing does that and more. That card is Sunbird Invocation. For 5 and a red, you get an enchantment that says whenever you cast a spell from your hand, reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the mana value of the spell cast. You may cast a spell with mana value X or less from among the cards revealed this way without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In a sort of cascade-like effect here, you're getting, random spells off of your deck for whatever you can cast into it, but it costs 6 mana and doesn't do anything when you cast it. So it's kind of a difficult thing to work around. However, in this case, if you can get something big to cast, like a 7-drop or another 6-drop right after it, you can look at the top 6-7 cards and you can pick anything that's a 6 or 7 or less to cast out of your hand for free. That's pretty powerful, and if you can chain effects like that where you can cast multiple things, you're going to eventually build up the value off of this for getting those free casts and eventually take over the game that way. So what are some of your favorite do nothings that you use, and what kind of decks do you put them into? Put them in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.